It's good to see everyone this morning. Appreciate everyone being here. We are going to continue on with our study of the miracles today. We are going to be looking at that account that Stewie just read, and apologies for that, Stewie. That typo was on my part because I had put down verse 32. But we're going to be looking at the account of Jesus walking on the water. We mentioned this last week that this miracle in John is actually a little peculiar because it actually happens in the middle of the account that we studied last week. Last week, we were looking at the feeding of the 5,000. And so there from John chapter 6, you have the actual miracle of the feeding of the 5,000. And then you have the miracle of Jesus walking on the water. And then you have the remainder of the account, more or less, continuing the feeding of the 5,000, where Jesus starts talking about his body and his blood. And that whole account ends, of course, with many disciples walking with him no more, verse 66. And then Jesus saying to the 12, "Do you also want to go away?" But Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life." So it's a little odd because you have this miracle, you have this discourse after the miracle, and what happens in between all those things is the walking on the water. And so that's where we're going to look at today. And so this miracle is actually mentioned in Matthew, Mark, and John. It's not mentioned in Luke. And each one of the accounts of it mentions things that are subtly different. Just for example, Matthew's account is the only one that includes when Peter says, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." John doesn't mention that. Mark doesn't mention that. And so there are different details that are mentioned in each one that aren't mentioned in the others. So we're just going to look at each one of the accounts. We'll start with John 6, the scripture reading, where Stewie read a moment ago from verse 15 down through verse 21. We won't read it again. As it begins, it says that Jesus perceived, there in verse 15, he perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king. We touched on this last week. But the bottom line is no, ultimately, only God could make Jesus Lord and Christ. When you think about, even in our country, what gives us the authority to appoint a new president? Right? The Constitution, I would assume. It's man's laws, right? We the people. We have to be endued somewhat with some measure of authority to appoint someone president. I couldn't just come out and say, "Mark, we're going to appoint you the new president of the United States of America." Why can't I do that? It's because I didn't go through the process, and the process involves authority. Well, all these people, Jesus perceives they're about to make him king. What gave them the authority to crown anybody a king? They don't have the authority to do this. Right? Now, who made Jesus both Lord and Christ? And so you start thinking about issues pertaining to authority. That's Acts chapter 2, where that phrase is found when Peter's preaching on the day of Pentecost. "This Jesus whom you crucified, God hath made both Lord and Christ." Only God had the authority to do it. Right? Even back then, one of the things that is spoken about, there were many who claimed to be Christ. And so it's not just something that man takes upon himself. No, God made him Lord and Christ. And so when he perceived they're about to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. We know from the parallel accounts, it actually says that he dismissed the people. So it's not like he's just running away. That's not what's going on here. He actually dismissed the people, and he departed again to the mountain by himself. It says, alone, here in John's account. We know from the parallels, he went there to pray, is what he did. And when you just stop and think about it, it's just interesting. They're ready to make him king. They want to be around him. We know they want to be around him because here in the next verses, with the discourse, they're looking for him. You would think if it was anybody else, after feeding 5,000 people with just a little boy's lunch, you would stand around and you would glad hand and you would get to know everybody and you would talk and this and that. And Jesus actually withdraws himself. He actually dismisses the people and he goes off by himself wanting to be alone. As I said, the parallel accounts say to pray. There are times where we need solitude. There are times where we need to be alone. We may be going through things much like, to think about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. There Jesus was with the 11 disciples, right? The 11 apostles. Judas has already gone out. He has the 11, but then he draws off Peter, James, and John by themselves a little further. And then he tells them, stay here, watch and pray while I go, right? And he goes and he prays. And so Peter, James, and John are drawn away from the 11 even. And it's like, there are things you would think, again, if it was man writing the book, if it was man writing the Bible, it's like, you would think Jesus would stand around with the 11 apostles or kneel down and they would all hold hands together and they would all pray together. And surely that's what they would do. No, Jesus says, you stay here while I go over there alone to pray. You might think about how there are some things we go through in life that, frankly, the church just doesn't understand. There are some things that we go through in life where our closest friends may not understand. There are times where the only person who would understand would be God. You may have gone through things in your life, physically or spiritually, where if I tried to say, and Brandon, I'm just thinking about you and everything you've gone through. Please do not ever go to Brandon with everything he's dealt with his kidneys and say, I understand what you've gone through. If I said that, Brandon, I would be a liar. There are some things like we don't understand. That's why we go alone to God, because God understands. And so here Jesus is in the feeding of the 5,000, and he just wants to be alone. He doesn't want to be alone with his disciples. He just wants to be alone to pray. Matthew's account actually tells us why. You might turn over there, turn back to Matthew. In Matthew chapter 14, the way the feeding of the 5,000 begins is by saying this. In Matthew chapter 14, at verse 13, says, when Jesus heard it, he departed from there by boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the multitudes heard it, they followed him on foot from the cities. And when Jesus went out, he saw a great multitude, and he was moved with compassion for them and healed their sick. And then you start getting into the rest of the miracle, right? That's the beginning of the feeding of the 5,000. But that whole thing begins with when Jesus heard it. And it's like, well, when Jesus heard what? And all you have to do is back up just a few verses. Verse 9. And the king was sorry, nevertheless, because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, he commanded it to be given to her. So he sent and had John beheaded in prison, and his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. Then his disciples came and took away the body and buried it, and went and told Jesus. And when Jesus heard it, he departed from there by boat. So now do you understand why Jesus wanted to be alone? News has just come that his friend, his co-worker, his relative even, because they're related, John the Baptist has been beheaded. That word has just come. Do you really think Jesus wants to stand around and glad hand everybody? No. There are times where we need solitude, where we want to be alone so we can meditate and so we can pray to God. And Jesus knows what's in store for him, and Jesus knows what's been happening to others, and Jesus knows what's in store for the apostles. He knows all these things. And so I appreciate Matthew's account telling us why the Lord wanted to be alone. John's account, one more thing before we move on to Mark's account, but John's account actually says, back in that passage, says that they had rowed 3 or 4 miles back in John chapter 6. And I wanted you to hang on to that thought. So they're crossing the Sea of Tiberias which is the Sea of Galilee. So there in verse 19, so when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near the boat, and they were afraid. So hang on to that. They rowed 3 to 4 miles, and now we come to Mark's account. We're going to look at the rest of Matthew's account last, but go ahead and come to Mark chapter 6. In Mark chapter 6, we'll read this account as well. See if you notice a few details. Verse 45 says, immediately he made his disciples, right? So after the miracle, immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, to Bethsaida. So he's actually sending his disciples away, right? He commands them to get into the boat and to go to Bethsaida while he sent the multitude away. And when he had sent them away, he departed to the mountain to pray. Now when evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. Then he saw them straining at rowing, for the wind was against them. Now about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea, and would have passed them by. And when they saw him walking on the sea, they supposed it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were troubled. But immediately he talked with them and said to them, be of good cheer, it is I, do not be afraid. Then he went up into the boat to them, and the wind ceased, and they were greatly amazed in themselves beyond measure, and marveled. For they had not understood about the loaves, because their heart was hardened. And that's the little tidbit in Mark's account that isn't mentioned in the others. They hadn't understood something about the loaves. So to look at the account, so it's about the 4th watch of the night. When that is, that's between 3 and 6 a.m. That is full on right. That is right before the sun breaks, right before sunrise. That's the 4th watch. Now to look at Mark's account, it sure does look like, based on verse 45 through verse 47, Jesus sends them away. Verse 47, now when evening came, so what time did he send them away? I don't know, but it was before dark. And so let's just say, I'm going to assume that it's not the middle of winter over there, because they've just all sat down, right? The 5,000 sat down in the grass. So I don't think it's the middle of winter. So let's just, for the sake of saying it, what time does sunset right now around here? 9:30, something like that, whatever like that. So let's just say 9 o'clock. Sometime before 9 o'clock, Jesus sends them all away. And he goes up to the mountain to pray. And then he looks out, and it's the 4th watch of the night, verse 48. So between 3 and 6 a.m. So how long have they been trying to get across the Sea of Galilee? And they've gone 3 or 4 miles. One of the accounts, and it might be Mark's, it says, verse 47, now when evening came, the boat was in the middle of the sea. And so they had probably been rowing for at least 6 hours. And if they've only gone between 3 and 6 miles, what John's account said, if they've only gone that far, that means at the most they've been going on average about half a mile per hour. We've touched on this before, but I love the account, because you can walk faster than half a mile per hour. Anybody can walk faster than half a mile per hour. And we know people can walk faster than half a mile per hour, because what was Jesus going to do? He was actually going to pass them by. Most people, they walk around 3 miles per hour, around 2 to 3 miles per hour. These guys have been struggling at the oars. When Jesus sees them out in the middle of the sea and the wind's against them, and they've only gone 3 to whatever it said, those few miles, they've been rowing for at least 6 hours, and they're not getting anywhere fast. Without Jesus, you go nowhere fast. It specifically says the wind was against them. And I kind of wonder if they got to a certain point and they may have been averaging half a mile per hour, they might be coming backwards. I don't know. But Mark's account specifically says He's walking on the sea and would have passed them by. Without Jesus, you ain't going nowhere quick. We may think we are, but without Jesus, And so they had not understood about the feeding of the 5,000. You might consider, and I think this is one reason that it happens the way that it does, that this miracle is in the middle of the feeding of the 5,000. As they're all greatly amazed in themselves beyond measure, and they marveled, they had not understood about the loaves. Now remember, again, Matthew's account is going to be Peter saying, Lord, if it's you, command me to come. And so that means the whole account of Peter starting to sink and Jesus saving him and them coming back to the boat, that means that all happens. All of this is happening before the rest of John chapter 6. So there in John chapter 6, when Jesus turns to the apostles, and says, do you also want to go away? And it's Simon Peter that says, where shall we go, Lord? Where shall we go? We have come to believe. It took this miracle to convince them. Up until this point, they had not understood about the loaves. Verse 52, because their heart was hardened. What exactly they didn't understand, I don't know, but they didn't understand something because of their hard hearts. We're not talking about the disciples who left in John chapter 6 and walked with him no more. That's not who Jesus is in the boat with right now. He's in the boat with the apostles. The apostles had not understood something about the loaves, and it's not until now that they're starting to be convinced. When you really think about it, and we touched on this last week. Again, the feeding of the 5,000. Was it spectacular? Certainly. In the grand scheme of things, was it life-changing? Right? Remember that point? It's like, well, no, they're going to be hungry the next day. And so it's like, okay, you have the feeding of the 5,000. I'm not sure what's going on in the apostles' hearts and minds other than it says their heart was hardened. But I was thinking about the miracles. And there were miracles in the Old Testament. And there were miracles that were similar to the feeding of the 5,000 in the lives of Elijah and Elisha, where you have a widow being seen to with just, the jar of flour, jar of oil. You have that whole account. And so to look at Israel's history, it's like, well, things like this have somewhat happened before. It seems like it's Elisha, if I remember correctly, who actually served, I can't remember if it's 100 men or perhaps more, from just a little amount of food. So this has happened before. But walking on water, calming the sea, at some point, the apostles are like, we haven't seen anything like this before. Those other things, we've heard about stuff like that. The feeding of the 5,000, but it took this miracle to convince them. And you might specifically think about Simon Peter. Something convinced Simon Peter so much that when everybody else leaves, Simon Peter, right, when they all walked away there in John 6, verse 6, many of the disciples, I should say, when Simon Peter says, where shall we go? We have come to believe you are the Christ. This miracle is what convinced him. And probably it's Matthew's account when he starts to sink and all of a sudden Jesus catches him. And so you might consider that whole idea. And so to look on to the next passage in Matthew 14. Come to Matthew 14 now. And again, Mark says he would have passed them by. But in Matthew 14. In Matthew chapter 14, let's read Matthew's account that talks about Peter. Matthew 14, verse 22 says, immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he sent the multitudes away. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now when evening came, he was alone there. But the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Now in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them, walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, "It is a ghost." And they cried out for fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Be of good cheer. It is I. Do not be afraid." And Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." So he said, "Come." And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him, and said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Then those who were in the boat came and worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Peter, "Lord, if it is you," pardon that typo, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come." That is a strange thing to say. I mean, we know the account, but it's like, really? What? I mean, just back up. If you've never heard that before, just think about that. That's a weird thing to say. Not, "Lord, if it's you, come closer." Lord, if it's you, come get into the boat. No, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water." That's a real strange thing to say, and it's an even stranger thing to do. And I'm sure you've heard this point before. What do you think the other apostles were thinking when Peter climbed down over the side of the boat? Do you think the other apostles were like, "I think Peter's finally, literally and metaphorically, gone off into the deep end"? But that's Peter for you. People always want to know, well, how far did Peter walk on the water? And it doesn't say. It doesn't say. Now we know Jesus immediately, when he started to sink, when he began to sink, verse 30, he cried out, saying, "Lord, save me." And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand. You might consider that word "immediately" shows up multiple times in this account. You might look, when they all think it's a ghost, verse 27. Immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Be of good cheer." When Peter began to sink, immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him. The other time the word "immediately" shows up was back in John's account. And it was a part of the miracle that most people don't remember or don't notice. Back in John 6, in that account, I'll just read it real quick. Then they willingly received him into the boat. Now, where are they at when he gets into the boat? They're in the middle of the sea, right? Then they willingly received him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at land where they were going. How long did it take them, with Jesus in the boat, how long did it take them to go from halfway across the Sea of Galilee to the destination? Immediately. And it's the same word that is used all three times. Immediately Jesus spoke out and said, "It is I." And immediately when Peter began to sink, and when Peter cried out, and immediately Jesus stretched out his hand. Now my point is, how fast was that boat going when they immediately got to port? It was instant. My point is, Peter did not have to be directly next to Jesus. How quickly could Jesus have gotten to Peter when he began to sink? He could have gotten there instantly. The same word is used. And immediately, Jesus grabbed him. You might think about, because people always ask the question, well, how far must Peter have walked on the water? A better question might be, how far do you think Peter walked on the water before he got scared? You know, the storm is brewing. The wind is blowing. It's not like the wind, it's not like, do you really think that Peter walked 100 yards? Oh, and then he saw the waves. Do you think he walked 100 yards and then he saw the wind? Because that's, the account says, but when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid and began to sink. Well, how far do you think he walked before getting scared? You think he was able to walk 75 yards before it finally struck him? Ooh, I'm not sure I can do this. Or do you think perhaps Jesus was a lot closer? Or even if he wasn't, how long would it take Jesus to get there? It would take no time at all. Just as much time as it took the boat to get from halfway across the sea to the other side. So you might consider it. Doesn't really matter a whole lot. Immediately, Jesus stretched out his hand. If it was you, if you were in Jesus' sandals, and a lot of these things are being done, if not all of these things, are being done to teach the apostles, follow me and I will make you fishers of men. We have a 3-year training course. Why was Jesus going to pass them by? Why would you do that? Why would you pass them by? So that you could be on the other side and welcome them when they get there. Perhaps. It's all being done to teach them and train them. So if all this is being done to teach them and train them, don't you think it would be a good lesson for Peter? How far do you think the Lord should let him sink before he saves him? If it was you, how far would you let Peter sink? Would you let him get calf deep at least? Maybe waist deep? Would it be like in the movies where all you could see was his lips sticking out of the water trying to breathe one last grasp? Wouldn't you think, man, if we really need to teach Peter a lesson, let's let him sink almost all the way down. And yet that's not what Jesus does. When he was afraid and beginning to sink, he cried out saying, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand. Immediately, when he cries out. As they got into the boat, the wind ceased, verse 32. You might notice the wind ceased without a word from Jesus. It's a whole nother account when Jesus calms the storm. When they come to him and he's asleep in the boat, right? They come to him and they say, Master, don't you care that we're perishing? And he gets up and he rebukes the sea, peace, be still. Did Jesus really need to say anything to the storm to calm it? It's like, no. Just like here, they get into the boat and the wind ceased. What do you think? You think the front had just gone through? It's like, oh, the front's gone through and the wind's died down. Everything's good now. It's like, no, it's another part of the miracle. And he just didn't have to even say a word. When they, verse 32, and when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. It's wonderful. And again, immediately they arrived, John 6. But you might also consider, did the Lord really need to get into the boat? When they got into the boat, did Jesus really need to get into the boat? How wet do you think? Do you think the Lord's sandals even got wet? Do you think his garments got wet? I don't think so. How hard, do you really think it was that hard for the Lord to walk across the sea? No. You think like the wind impeded him at all? No. So did the Lord really need to get into the boat? No. What that makes us do is that should cause us to be very thankful that the Lord gets into the boat with us. When they, verse 32, and when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. The Lord didn't need to get into the boat. He got into the boat for them, is what he did. And so we think about the fellowship that we have with Jesus. Because ultimately, does Jesus really need us? Like really, really need us? Not really. So are we thankful for the fellowship that we have with Jesus? The fact that he got into the boat with them and we can be in the same boat with the Lord, so to speak. Might consider it. Come back to John 6. Come back to John 6. As we've been going through the miracles in John, In John 6, and this is the reason that I wanted the scripture reading to include verse 22. Verse 21, then they willingly received him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at land where they were going. Verse 22, on the following day, when the people who were standing on the other side of the sea saw that there was no other boat there except the one which his disciples had entered, and that Jesus had not entered the boat with his disciples, but his disciples had gone away alone. And we'll just pause right there. So they know wherever they're looking, there is no other boat there. And they know, they apparently saw Jesus send the disciples away, the apostles. Right? So they know there's no other boat there except the one which his disciples had entered, and they know that Jesus had not gotten into the boat with them. Right? So even though Jesus has dismissed them, either as they're dismissed or they're hanging around, someone's hanging around, and they know there's no other boat there except that one boat, and all of the Lord's apostles, they got in that boat, and the Lord sent them away, and he had gone up on the mountain. Who knows what he's doing? We know because we can read it. And so now on the following day, when the people who saw all that, they finally find boats. Verse 23, other boats came from Tiberias near the place where they ate bread after the Lord had given thanks. Verse 24, when the people therefore saw that Jesus was not there, nor his disciples, they also got into boats and came to Capernaum seeking Jesus. And when they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, Rabbi, when did you come here? They're like, wait a minute. We only saw one boat. We saw you send your apostles in the boat. You weren't in the boat with them. We saw that. You're up on the mountain. And yet here they are and here you are. And they're like, how did you get here? How did you get here? They track Jesus down. Rabbi, when did you come here? That's what they really ask. When did you come here? Not how. When did you come here? And Jesus answered them and said, most assuredly, I say to you, you seek me not because you saw the signs, but because you ate of the loaves and were filled. You want to talk about missing the boat? They were missing the boat. That's what was happening. They were missing the boat, and they just wanted to fill their bellies. And that's where we were studying last week, the back half of the account. They just wanted to feed their bellies. And then Jesus starts talking to them about his body and his blood. And many of these individuals again. Over in verse 66. And from that time, many of his disciples went back and walked with him no more. They walked away from the one who had walked on water. They walked away from Jesus. Rabbi, when did you get here? When did you come here? Their hearts were hardened. They had ate the loaves and the fishes, but they were missing the boat. And so to think about the account, and you might just ask yourself some questions. Would you ever just like to get away? Would you ever just like to get away from everyone? And that is what Jesus says. And this isn't the only place he does it. And this isn't the only place he talks about it. When he talks about prayer, he says, when you pray, don't stand on the street corner so that everybody can see you. He says, no, when you pray, go into your room and go into the closet and pray to your Father in the secret place. Be alone with the Lord. And so if there are ever times where you would just like to get away from everyone, congratulations, Jesus was like that too. He just wanted to be alone. News had come about John the Baptist, and John was dead, and he just wanted to be alone. How many miracles actually happen in the walking on the water? Because it's more than one. It's more than one. Jesus walks on the water. That's one. When they get up into the boat, the storm ceases, the wind ceases. That's two. And immediately they're on the other side, and that's three. So there's actually at least three miracles right there when it gets down to it. And again, when the Lord saves Peter, how hard was it for the Lord to walk on the water? It wasn't. How hard was it for the Lord to do anything in that sense? And let me clarify that statement. Let me put it this way. Do you think when he was walking on water, do you think he broke a sweat? I doubt it. But before going to the cross, and when he's praying in the Garden of Gethsemane, what does it say about his sweat? Became like great drops of blood. My soul is exceedingly sorrowful. And so from that perspective, as Jesus was learning obedience even to the point of death, you start thinking about things that are more difficult because he submitted to the cross. But as far as walking on water, I don't think he broke a sweat. I don't think even remotely. I don't think it was hard for the Lord to walk on the water. I don't think it was hard for the Lord to walk against that wind. I don't think it was hard for the Lord to calm that storm. And what it really gets down to, how hard do you really think it was for the Lord to save Peter? You think when he caught him, it's like, how much do you think Peter weighed? Well, let's see. We know the point that's usually made when they're running to the tomb after Jesus' resurrection, and him and John are running, and do you remember which one got there first? Seems like wasn't it John who got there first, that John outran him? So let's say Peter was 210 pounds. Whatever. How hard was it for the Lord to save him? Do you think he really had to strain hard to really get him to not sink? Not really. How hard is it for the Lord to save us? Well, from one perspective, it took going to the cross. But from another perspective, how hard is it for the Lord to save us? What'd the man say? What hinders me from being baptized? If you believe, you may. I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of the living God. And with that, he commanded the chariot to stand still, and they both went down into the water. And they came up, the Ethiopian eunuch and Philip. And how wonderful is it, as we offer the invitation, how wonderful is it that the Lord, who was going to pass them by, did not pass them by. He got into the boat with them. And what a wonderful thing it is that the Lord doesn't pass us by. If you're here this morning, if you're not a Christian, put on Christ in baptism. Turn from your sins, confessing Jesus Christ as the Son of God, and be baptized. And the power of the Lord will save you just as assuredly as the Lord saved Peter from drowning. The Lord has that power and the Lord has that authority to forgive sin. So if you're here and need to respond, please come today while we stand and while we sing the invitation.